Welcome back to Manchester, where we're digesting the Prime Minister's speech as leader, of course, of the Conservative Party to the Tory conference. With me, Isabel Oakeshott, Graham Davis and our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Now, I see that the Prime Minister's just announced that he's gone on to Snapchat. So he's,
what could possibly go wrong?
He's down with the kids at retail, at least as he would see it that way. You've been looking at some of the other reaction on social media. What have you found?
So we've got Nick Bowles, MP, of course, no great fan of the Prime Minister or indeed Brexit, who's criticised the speech as a bit of a blancmange. He says that Boris Johnson is an entertainer, not an orator, and the speech was all sugar and air. And another one I liked from commentator Rupert Myers, again a Remainer, who says, I don't understand why anyone gives a fig in the Johnson about how the Johnson family voted on Brexit. They are the British political equivalent of the Kardashians, noisy but essentially pointless. And of course, Boris did draw attention to his family, both by talking about how his mother voted, but also by making that reference to the Corbynistas being fratricidal Marxists, which I thought was a particularly ill-judged comment, given that his own brother, of course, launched that awful manoeuvre on him just at the most sensitive moment by bailing out of his government, and his sister Rachel hasn't been entirely complimentary of her brother either. So fratricide, that's something the Johnsons know all about.
And Boris Johnson often at his best when he manages to mix humour with political point and run through this speech today.
Absolutely. One of the big arguments Boris Johnson made at the start of the speech is that he believes we need an election, and he criticised Jeremy Corbyn for delaying and not voting for that election on a number of occasions in the comments. Let's hear just exactly how he did that.
There is one part of the British system that seems to be on the blink. If Parliament were a laptop, then the screen would be showing, I'm afraid, the pizza wheel of doom. If Parliament were a school, Ofsted would be shutting it down or putting it in special measures. If Parliament were a reality TV show, then the whole lot of us, I'm afraid, would have been voted out of the jungle by now. But at least we'd have had the consolation of watching the Speaker being forced to eat a kangaroo testicle.
Well, probably the first party leader to talk about kangaroo testicles during his conference speech. What did you make of that bit? The humour was still there, wasn't it?
It was, but it was almost as if he got stuck in after dinner mode. When you're doing a serious speech, whether it's a business one or a political speech, you should aim to take the audience to a very specific destination. And it's ironic that he walked onto stage with a backing track of The Road to Nowhere, because in the end, that's precisely where he left his audience.
And Isabel, I mean, it has been said or alleged by largely the sort of Remainer section that, you know, one of the things the Tories are trying to do is to sort of whip up populist outrage against Parliament, which was certainly attacked against this establishment. Did you feel that the speech did that?
Achieve that, if that's what it set out to achieve. And I think we've been talking about how the reaction to the speech from people coming out has been a little bit more muted than normal after a leader's speech at a Tory party conference. And I wonder whether the audience were looking for a bit more rabble-rousing on Brexit. You know, I think that they were ready to respond, you know, and there was that bit where it fell rather flat when he said, you know, because we are Europeans. And actually, Boris, that's part of his dilemma over Brexit, was that he always has felt very European. That didn't really resonate with the audience. I think that they probably wanted a bit more punch when it came to the Brexit stuff. But Boris, of course, at this very sensitive moment, has to think about the European audience.
I mean, Sam, do you think it's possibly because they haven't really made up their mind whether they want to press that button?
I think that one of the things that this speech does, one of the things that politically it aims to do is slightly reposition Boris Johnson back as a one-nation Conservative, having moved away from that in recent weeks. One of the most striking moments this week is where Boris Johnson was asked whether or not he endorsed that sentiment on last Sunday's Mail on Sunday front page, where they talked about traitors who'd been working against the government over Brexit. And he said, well, frankly, there are people who've got questions to answer on that, appearing to endorse the sentiment of that extraordinary Mail on Sunday front page. What he did in the hall just now was try and anchor himself back. In his peroration, he said, let's get on with a sensible, moderate, one nation but tax-cutting Tory government. He's trying to reclaim a lot of that agenda in order to appear a little bit more amenable, go after those Labour votes for the election that could well happen at the end of November and the start of December. We're sitting in the conference a sort of exhibition area, and all around us are signs saying we're going to invest on schools, we're going to build more hospitals for the NHS. The message of this conference that they want people out there to hear is that the Conservatives, after years of austerity, are ready to spend again. The question, I think, is whether or not the noise of this matters. Boris Johnson's own personal problems, what's been going on Brexit and the rest, whether that noise has obscured that message being heard by voters.
It seemed to me as if the overall tone of the speech was more of a restrained negotiating position than that of being the inspiring words of a party leader. He almost... I look back to Ian Duncan Smith back in, I think, 2003. He wasn't a great political orator by anybody's standards, indeed. I know, please bear with me for a moment. In one of his speeches, admittedly rather stooged by various members of Conservative Party staff, he got 12 standing ovations in the middle of his speech.
That was the one a month before he was sacked by his MPs.
Indeed.
Yeah.
But of course, there was nothing. This particular audience was aching to give Boris standing ovations during the middle of this one, and there was absolutely nothing to get up for.
There just wasn't much red meat, was there? I mean, I was struck by the number of references to tax cutting and a critique of the Corbyn approach on that, and it does seem to sort of set the stage for some significant tax cutting policies in the next election.
Now, of course, as far as we can tell, this strategy of going after working class dominated seats in the Midlands and the north of England is predicated on putting Nigel Farage back in his box and putting Brexit back in his box. What did he do on that?
Well, there was one and only one brief reference to Nigel Farage where he talked, I think, about sort of saying we tried to export him to America and he's back. It's not exactly a friendly sort of olive branch to Nigel Farage, who has, of course, been trying very hard to get into a position where the Brexit Party could potentially do some sort of electoral deal with the Conservatives. That has been pushed back time and again by Number 10, and there Boris was not sounding at all conciliatory.
The question, bluntly, for cabinet ministers at this conference: lose seats in Scotland and the southwest and places like Cheltenham because of the politics of no deal and because of the Brexit tone of this government. Can they make net gains in North Wales, the Midlands and the north of England? Frankly, it's unknowable. The polls are quite good for Boris Johnson at the moment, the voting intention polls and companies like YouGov. But they're also no reliable indicator yet what would happen if there was a general election almost immediately. And I think that what will determine the politics of this moment will not be the speech today, but it will be the circumstances in which we go into a general election. Deal, no deal, extension. We don't know which of those it's going to be, and that will determine the politics.
Well, with the exception of the SNP still to come in the middle of October, that's pretty much the end of the UK party conference season. But very clear the government has an awful lot to play for, both in negotiations with the European Union and in the Houses of Parliament. What we can say, though, is that Boris Johnson now will be heading back to Westminster, having delivered his first leader's speech to conference.